Welcome to this Wise Owl tutorial on using expressions within SQL Server integration services. Here's what you'll learn in the tutorial. We'll begin with a look at the example used for this tutorial, then go straight into creating basic expressions. We'll then look at some more advanced expressions, before going on to look in more detail at the ternary operator or the question mark symbol. We'll then look at how to create expression tasks in integration services, and finally, look at how to complete your project so that you can see it working. So let's get started. Before we look at expressions in detail, I thought it would be useful to see where I'm trying to get to. We're aiming to create a package with two tasks. One will be something called an expression task to work out a message I want to display on screen, and then I'll actually use a script task to show that message. So if I run this package, you should see that it displays my required message, which is whether it's a weekend or not, and how many days there are till Christmas. A rather strange example, but it will be useful for showing the various ways in which you can use expressions in integration services. Before creating some expressions in integration services, I thought I'd have a quick look at where the language fits into the Microsoft programming language family. You've got the existing languages in Microsoft. You've got C#, SQL, VB and VBA, and there's also an element of new programming within SSIS. So that's where SSIS expressions fit in, I would say. They're mostly based on C# or C. There's an element of SQL in there, and there's new things which Microsoft programmers probably won't have seen before. What there isn't is any VB or VBA. So with that as background, let's have a look at creating our first variables and setting expressions for their values. You can create the variables window or make it appear by clicking on the little blue eraser symbol at the top right there. And what I'm going to do is create two variables. One of them is going to hold the current date and one of them is going to hold the current year. And we'll use these later to calculate the expressions saying whether it's a weekend or not and how many shopping days there are till Christmas. So to create the first variable, I can click on the blue eraser. I'm going to call this one current date. And because it's holding a date, I can just type in a D, or I could have clicked on the drop arrow and chosen the data type from there. Now instead of typing a value in for this, I want it to be an expression which always gives me today's date. So I can click on the three dots to the right of which is called an expression builder, and build up my expression from the list. There's two parts. There's a list of variables on the left hand side. At the moment I've only got the one. And there's a list of functions on the right. Now I want to show today's date, so it's a fair bet it's going to belong to datetime functions. So if I expand that, you can see that there's a fairly small number of date functions, and the one I want is getDate. If I let my mouse linger over it, it says it returns the current date of the system, and it also comes up with a description. What does take a bit of getting used to is the fact that when I double click on that, it doesn't put it into the expression at the bottom. What I have to do instead is click on it and drag it into the expression for that to work. So I've now got an expression, and if I click on this button saying evaluate expression, it will tell me whether it's valid. And you can see I'm creating this on the 11th of November 2013 at 11:07 in the morning. So there's a bit of familiarity for you. If you then choose OK, I've created my first variable. What I'm now going to do is create a second variable which is going to hold the current year. So to do this, I can choose to add a variable. I'm going to call this one current year, and it's going to hold an integer because it's a number of the year. What I can then do as before is click on the expression builder. Again, I'm looking for a date function, fairly obviously. And in this case, I want one which will give me the year corresponding to a date. So I can click on that, drag it down into the expression. Now, the bit in the middle there says that it expects a date to be filled in as the one argument to it. But what I can do is click on get date, is go to the variables, click on current date, which holds today's date, and I can drag it down over that argument. Now watch what happens when I get over it. The argument is selected in its entirety, and when I release the mouse button, what it will do is replace that argument with the name of the variable. You can see the name of the variable is a bit long-winded. It's got an @ symbol, then it's got user to signify it's a user variable and not a system one, and then it's actually got the name of the variable. So I can click on Evaluate Expression to see the value of this, and it says I'm in 2013, and if I choose OK, it will also show the value in grey there. So that's how you can create simple expressions. What we'll now do is go on to look at some more complicated ones. What I now want to do is create 3 new expressions to give how many days there are from now until Christmas. I'm going to do this in 3 stages to make it clearer what's going on and to show how to use expressions in SSIS. The first variable I'll create will give the date of Christmas Day for this year, but as a string of text, so it will evaluate to the 25th of December 2013. But that will be a string of text, and I'll use that format because I know that SSIS can convert that to a date format. What we'll then do is calculate what that is as a date, so we'll convert it to a date-time format. And finally, I'll take the difference between today's date and that date to work out that at the time of writing, there's 49 days till Christmas. But I've hard-coded all of those 3 variables in. What I need to do is create expressions to calculate them according to the current date. So let's start with the date of Christmas as in text format. So I'll create a new variable, and I'm going to call it Xmas date text. And it's going to be a string variable because it's going to hold a series of characters. And if I click on the expression builder, what I need to do then is build it up. What I would like to do is this. I'd like to take the current year, a variable I've already calculated, which will give me the 2013. And what I'd like to do is concatenate that with the month and the day. The concatenation symbol is a plus sign, which will be familiar to anyone who writes in SQL or C#, but may give VB programmers cause for concern. What I can then do is add on the month and the year, so starting with the most general thing, the year, and going to the most specific thing, the day. The problem is, if I evaluate that expression, it will give me an error. And what it's saying is that the date types DTI4 and DTWST are incompatible. And that's because I'm trying to concatenate or join together 2 things, one of which is text, but the other of which is an integer. And SSIS is extremely fussy about its data types. So what I need to do is convert this first thing to text. And I can do that by looking at the typecast functions. Casting is just a posh word for converting data types. So if I expand that, you can see for every single data type in SSIS, there's a corresponding conversion function. The one I want is something which will take this and turn it into text, and I've got 2 choices, dt_str or dt_wstr. I'm going to go for the second choice because it's simpler. With the first one, I'd have to specify the code page, whereas with the second one, I can just specify how long the text is, or rather should be. So I can drag that before the expression and change the length to be 4 characters, because that's how many characters are in a string of text. And when I evaluate that, it will give me the date as text. For VB programmers, and indeed for SQL ones, it may seem strange that you put the conversion function before the variable you're converting. But, as my daughter would say, you'll have to cope with that. It's just how it works in SSIS, and also how it works in C#, by the way. So we choose OK to confirm that. And what I'm now going to do is create a second expression to give the date of Christmas. So to do that, I can add another expression. I'll call it Xmas date. It's going to be a date-time expression. And this time, all I want to do is take the text of the Christmas date and convert it into a date-time format. So again, I'm looking for a typecast function. And the one I'm going to choose is dt_db timestamp, which will convert a string of text into a date-time format. So I can drag that into the expression builder. And then I can put in the thing I'm actually trying to convert, which is the Xmas date as text. And if I click on Evaluate Expression, what it will do is give me the date in a date format, which is what I wanted. And because I haven't specified a time, it assumes it's midnight, just when children are starting to open their presents perhaps. So if I choose OK to confirm that, I've got one more variable to create in this session, and that will give me how many days there are till Christmas. So I can add another variable. I'm going to call this one Xmas days, and it's going to be an integer. And to calculate this, I need to work out the difference between two dates. One of them is today's date, which is held in a variable called current date, and one of them is the date of Christmas Day. I could do this by subtracting one from the other, but there's a posher, better function in SSIS, which is the dateDiff function. The difference between dateAdd and dateDiff is that dateAdd takes a date and adds on a given number of days, weeks, months, quarters, years, whatever it may be, whereas dateDiff takes the difference between two dates, and you can see it says that in the description. So I can drag that in. I'll come back to the first argument at the end. For the moment, let's choose the start date and the end date. The start date is today's date, so I can drag that over the start date. And the end date is the date of Christmas Day itself. Now the question is, taking the difference between those two dates, do I want to say how many months there are between them, how many quarters, how many years, how many weekdays, or in this case, how many days? And the only practical way I can think of finding out what you should type in this argument is to go on Google or use help. But I've done that, and I know I want to take how many days there are. So I can evaluate that expression, and it will give me 49, the number of days between the two dates. So I can then choose OK to confirm that, and that completes my three expressions. The last variable we're going to create before we get into creating expression tasks is one to say whether it's a weekend or not. So I've created an example here which will say it's the weekend. I'm actually recording this on a Wednesday, so in fact when I create my expression it will say the opposite. It will say that it's a weekday. To do this we're going to use something called the ternary operator, which involves writing a condition, then putting a question mark, then putting what will happen if the condition turns out to be true, then putting a colon, and then putting what will happen if the condition turns out to be false. VB and probably Access and other programmers will recognize this as the if or the IIF function. But there's no function like that in SSIS, so instead you have to use a thing called a ternary operator. So let's have a go at creating this expression. So I'll choose to create a new variable, excuse me, and I'll call it weekend status. And it's going to be a string variable, and is going to have an expression. So the first thing I'm going to do is to put in my condition, which is in this case whether the weekday is a Saturday or a Sunday. Now the way I'm going to do that is, having searched for a weekday function here and not found it, I'm going to do the next best thing and use the date part function, which gives you an integer representing a date part of a date. Now that date part could be the day number, the month number, the week number, the year number, or as in this case, the weekday number. So if I drag that in, the date I want to use is the current date, so that's nice and easy. For the date part, it's back to Google or back to help again. In this case, what I actually want to type in is DW in quotation marks, which will give me the weekday number. And by default, weekdays start from Monday. So in fact, because it's a Wednesday, that will give me the number 3. So that's my start of my condition. What I now want to say is whether that equals 6 or 7. 6 being Saturday, 7 being Sunday. And to do that, I can use an operator, and my operator in this case is equals, and I can drag that in. Now I could of course have typed that in much more easily, but I was doing it to emphasize the fact that in SSIS, unlike in some other languages, you have to put the equal sign twice in a condition. So if that's 6, I would now want to say or, and again, if you're having problems remembering the syntax, the easiest thing to do is go to the list of operators, and you can see that and is written as ampersand ampersand, and or is written as 2 vertical bars, one after the other. So I could either type that in or drag it in. So either that equals 6 or that equals 7. And what I'm going to do is indulge in a bit of copying and pasting to save myself typing. And there's my condition. What I'm now going to do is say, if that's true, then what I want to do is put in a message saying it's a weekend. And I've put in some return codes to make my expression easier to read. They'll be ignored by SSIS. So if that's true, I want to say it's the weekend. And I think that deserves an exclamation mark. Otherwise, I'm going to put a message saying it's a weekday. And if I evaluate that expression, it will tell me it's a weekday, because as I've mentioned, I'm recording this on a Wednesday. So I can choose OK to confirm that, and that is how to create a ternary operator. So just as a refresher there, you put in the condition, you put a question mark, you put what happens if that's true, then you put a colon, and then you put what happens if that isn't true. For the final part of this tutorial, we're going to create and display the message saying whether it's the weekend or not and how many days there are till Christmas. As a first step, I'll create a variable, which I'll call message, to hold a string of text. Now what I could do is use the expression build as before to build up this message, but by way of variation, I'm going to instead use an expression task. Now if you can't see this, it's because you're not using the latest version of SQL Server. It's quite a new addition. So I can add that task into my control flow window and perhaps change the name of it so it says something more sensible. What it's going to do is calculate the message to be displayed, so I'll call it calculate the message. As with any other task, I can then double click on the icon to the left of it to configure how it's going to work. And what it's going to do is set the value of my message equal to something. Now the first thing it's going to do is put in the weekend status, so I can just drag that into the window, and that will give me the bit which says whether it's a weekend or weekday. What I can then do is concatenate something with that, and what I now want to do is put in two carriage returns, so that there's a blank line between my first message and my second one. In VBA you would do that by typing VBCRLF. In other languages you would use the ASCII characters 13 and 10. In SSIS and indeed in C#, you put in a \n for each carriage return you want to include. I can then have the words there are, and what I now want to do is put in how many days there are till Christmas. But it's no good just using this variable because that's an integer and I want it to be incorporated within a string of text. So what I'm going to do first is to convert it to text. I would have thought a maximum length of 3 would be sufficient because there can be most 365 days till Christmas, and then I can drag my variable in. So I've now got there are followed by a number. What I want to do to complete my message is just to type in days till Christmas, and if I evaluate that expression it would tell me it's a weekday, but if I scroll down you can see underneath that it's also got the message saying how many days there are till Christmas. So I can choose OK to confirm that, and that completes my expression task. What I'm now going to do very briefly is to explain how to display that message on screen, because this is all a refresher of things we've done in previous tutorials. So the first thing I want to do is to add a script task, and then I need to make sure that it follows on directly from the calculation of the message. I can double click on the script task to configure it and specify that I can pass the value of my message variable as a read-only variable into the task, and then I can go straight into editing the script using the default language, which is C#. The first and only thing it's going to do is display a message, so I can type in messagebox.show, and the message it will display is just the value of the variable, which is part of the variables collection. It's called message. I need to be careful to type that in the correct case. And it's actually the value of the variable I want to display. That's returned as an object, so what I need to do is convert that to a string of text to make sure that it displays correctly. And that's got rid of all the red underlinings, so I'm pretty confident that that's going to work. So I can then close down that project to return me back to my original one and choose OK. And if I've done everything correctly, when I play this, I should get the message saying it's a weekday and there are 49 days till Christmas. Just time to do my shopping. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial on Integration Services expressions. You can find loads more training resources on integration services, other aspects of SQL Server and .NET and Microsoft Office at www.wiseowl.co.uk.